Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming out tonight to listen about the nutrition and mental health, the scientific evidence. I'm Lorraine, and I work in UCD. I'm the head of human nutrition in UCD, and I work in the Institute of Food and Health in this building here. My main research team is really trying to understand how we metabolize our food and how the food that we metabolize has an impact on our health. And while mental health is not a main focus, we do some work in the area, and I'll touch on that at the end. Now, I chose to add the scientific evidence at the end of my title. And the reason I chose to do that is that there's a lot of evidence, or not a lot of information about food and nutrition and its effects on different health parameters that isn't scientifically proven or doesn't have a strong scientific evidence base to it. And what I'm going to focus on tonight is really what we would consider as scientists as important scientific evidence and what there is in the context of nutrition and mental health. So then what I'm going to do then through the next 40 to 45 minutes or so is to give you a background really on the different levels of scientific evidence. And I'll give you an overview of the emerging evidence there is to date on nutrition and mental health, or diet and mental health. I'll end up with some conclusions on that topic, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that's emerging from our own work in the context of personalised nutrition. So just to start with then about evidence, this is a pyramid that we often talk about when we talk about scientific evidence. And I'll talk through this because it'll make sense on where we get our information from so that we can make dietary guidelines or we can make recommendations for different health and disease conditions. So at the very bottom we have what we call observational studies, and these are studies where we look at a parameter. In our case it's nutrition or diet, and we look at it in relation to either a disease outcome or a health outcome. And these are what we call observational studies, and examples would be case studies or cohort studies. And this is really just looking at associations, so there's no directionality involved in it and we can't infer any directionality. We're really just looking at the associations between different parameters. So hence it's at the lower end of the pyramid. It's really kind of the base level of evidence. However, if you have multiple studies that are showing you the same evidence from these observational studies, then you can start to pull these together and start to get a better insight to what may be happening. And then you can start to design what we would call the ultimate study, which are these experimental studies or these randomized controlled trials. So these are our gold standard, and we really want to have randomized controlled trials if we're going to make recommendations. And by randomized controlled trials, what we're trying to do is to say if we modify or we change the diet of an individual, can we impact on their health or their health outcomes? So this is where we ultimately want to go. But this evidence down here, although it's lower in what we call the quality of the evidence, it's actually also very important. And when we garnish enough evidence from down here, then we can properly design randomized controlled trials to test out the hypothesis. And on top then we have what we call the appraisal of the data. And what this does is takes all the evidence together and it looks at, if I combine all of these studies, do I have an overall impact on the health outcome? So is diet really important in our instance for the particular health outcome we're interested in? And these are called systematic reviews, and when you combine all the information together, these are called meta-analysis. And these meta-analysis or systematic reviews can be done on the observational studies, so taking all the observational studies that are done across the world that have been published in the scientific literature to see, okay, if we look at all of the data as a totality, is there a relationship? It can also be done, if we have enough information, on the randomized controlled trials. And when we do that, then we can start to infer or make recommendations so that we can change the recommendations that we make. So this is the evidence that we want to work with, and I'm going to talk you through now tonight some of this evidence in the context of mental health. So some of the observational studies that have been done and observed relationships between nutrition and mental health, and 2 randomized controlled trials that have been done that have looked at the relationship between changing diet and a mental health outcome. So if we start then, before we start looking at the evidence, I have to raise the issue that this is very difficult to do in the context of nutrition. And there are reasons why it's difficult to do and why we have to be very cognizant of the issues we have when we're looking at the results. And the first issue is that it's very hard to assess dietary intake in a study, in any cross-sectional study or any group of individuals. And why that is because all our data, or the methods we have of doing it, are based on self-reported data. So what we do is we sit down with an individual and we ask them, what have you eaten for the last 24 hours? So just think about that for a minute. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to remember everything. The other options we have are we ask them to do food diaries, where we ask them to write down everything they're eating, and that's very burdensome on the individuals who are doing it. Another option is something called a food frequency questionnaire, where we ask them the frequency of consumption of certain foods over the last year. And again, there's an inherent bias in that type of data. So the limitations associated with this self-reported dietary data are well established. And the limitations include the fact that people often over-report foods that we perceive to be healthy, and they under-report foods that are perceived to be bad. So therefore, it's very difficult to get a true representation of dietary intake. On average, in any study that we would do, about 30% of the population will under-report their energy intake. So that's just to give you an idea of why sometimes we get mixed evidence coming out from our studies. The second point relates to the fact that up until about 10 years ago, we were really always focused in our studies about looking at single nutrients. So let's look at a particular food or a food group and look at the relationships with that particular health outcome. And we started to realize that actually we don't eat foods or nutrients on their own, we eat them in combination. So we sit down and we eat a dinner which is full of different foods and nutrients. So these foods will act in synergy with each other to have an impact on our health outcome. So there's been a big shift to work towards dietary patterns and to look at the dietary patterns of people and how that may have an influence on health. And I'll talk a bit about dietary patterns. The third point to really keep in mind is the bidirectional relationship between diet and mental health. And by that I mean somebody with mental health problems will often start having a poor diet as a result of the mental health problems, and then we never know which direction the relationships or the associations we're seeing in the data. And then finally, randomized controlled trials, which I said on the previous slide are our gold standards, are very difficult to do when you're working with foods. They're easier to do when you're working with capsules or pills in our drugs, but when you're working with whole foods, it's very difficult to do. Adherence is problematic, and adherence in the control group is even more problematic, because we get people into these randomized controlled trials that are very willing, they're knowledgeable about the area, they're willing to try something out, and they think that diet and nutrition may help them. And then they find themselves randomized to the control group, which is no dietary intervention, and they automatically start trying to improve their diet. So this has been a major hindrance in doing randomized controlled trials of when we're talking about foods and dietary patterns. And we often, or we cannot, double blind them, because you know what you're eating, you can see the food that you're eating. So it's an inherent problem that we have when we're doing randomized controlled trials. And as a result, a number of larger randomized controlled trials have often found no difference between the control group, because the control group actually also changed their diet. So keeping all those in mind, I'm going to now start working through the evidence that we have in the literature. So it is important to also remind in mind that actually there are some really nice emerging data that is showing that there is some nice link between nutrition and mental health. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. And I'm going to break it down into data from observational studies and data from randomized controlled trials. So the base level and then the gold standard that we consider. So the first one is, what do we know from these observational studies? And I picked out 3 systematic reviews. So these are reviews that looked at all of the data at different time points in the literature to see what, if you look at the accumulation or the totality of the data, is there a relationship between nutrition and diet and mental health, and the majority of them looked at the relationship with depression. So this first study was published back in 2014, and it was a very exciting study at the time, and a lot of people were talking about it, and it was one of the best and the first systematic reviews and meta-analysis in the area. And what they done is they looked at all of the literature and they boiled it down to 25 studies that they found that were of good quality and could meet their inclusion and exclusion criteria. And when they looked at these 25 studies, there were 13 of those studies that had comparable definitions of dietary patterns. So they were able to look at the dietary patterns and see if adherence to a healthy dietary pattern had a risk or association or not with the risk of depression. And this is called the forest plot, and what you have here, if there was no association, all the studies would lie at 1. And then this is the overall evidence down here in the kind of diamond style in the red box. And what you can see, it's shifted from 1, and it actually has a value of 0.84. And this means that this is an odds ratio, and this means that there is a significant reduced risk of depression if you have adhered to a healthy dietary pattern. And you can see that this evidence down here is taken from all of these 13 studies. So what they concluded in that paper was, when they looked at the data, that the higher intakes of a healthy diet, which comprised of higher intakes of fruit, vegetable, fish and whole grains, was associated with a reduced likelihood of depression. So the next study then that I pulled out was looking at the Mediterranean diet. And in this study, they again done a meta-analysis, so looking at the totality of all of the data. And they looked at adherence to the Mediterranean diet for risk of stroke, cognitive impairment and depression. So first off, what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, the Mediterranean diet is really more than a diet, it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that people in the Mediterranean have. And it's really conducive to eating around a family table, doing a lot of exercise, having really high consumption of these foods down here, which are vegetables, fruit, extra virgin olive oil, nuts and legumes. They have moderate consumption of oily fish, and they have moderate consumption of red wine, and they have little or no, very limited consumption of red meat, processed meat and confectionery such as cakes, etc. So the question that they asked in this study was, if we look at all of the evidence for adherence to this type of diet, this Mediterranean style diet, is there a relationship with stroke, cognitive impairment and depression? So the first one they looked at was stroke, and again, these are all the studies that met their requirements. Again, if there's no relationship, it lies on the 1, and to the left, it means that there is a significant protective effect of adhering to the Mediterranean diet. And then when they combine all of the studies together, you get a significant protective effect, again with an odds ratio of 0.71, showing a significant, if you adhere to the Mediterranean diet, you have a lower risk of developing stroke. The next one they looked at was depression, and again you can see the series of studies that they pulled out, and they were from case-controlled studies, cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies. And again, you can see that the majority of the studies are sitting to the left of this mark 1, indicating that they showed a positive association with reduced risk for depression. And the overall adherence odds ratio was 0.6 for the relationship between adherence to a Mediterranean diet and the risk of depression. So the Mediterranean diet had a protective effect against risk of depression. And again, for cognitive impairment, what they looked at here was a series of studies, and they found again that there was a relationship between high adherence of the Mediterranean diet and a risk for cognitive impairment. And again, you have a lower odds ratio for that in comparing the totality of the studies. So what did they conclude overall then? What they concluded was adherence to the Mediterranean diet was inversely associated with stroke, cognitive impairment and depression. So this was the second study looking at all of the observational data that was in the literature. And then the third study that came out was more recently, was just last year in 2017. And here they looked at dietary patterns and depression risk. And again, they done a meta-analysis. So looking at all of the data that has been published, looking at dietary patterns and depression risk. And again, they produced one of these forest plots. And you can see again that most of the studies are lying to the left of one. And again, here, what they're saying is that a healthy dietary pattern, if you adhered to it, you had a reduced risk of depression. So if we take all of these studies together, and these are observational studies and a meta-analysis, what we can conclude and what we can see is that there's many studies reporting associations between adherence to a healthy dietary pattern and a reduced risk or likelihood of mental health disturbances. What's really important to realise about all of these studies is that they're emerging from many different countries, diverse cultures. There's a huge age range involved, so it's starting to become quite strong evidence. So when we see this and we see the concurrent evidence from different publications, then the evidence starts to become stronger. And more importantly, all the studies used a range of methods to assess diet, and they also used a range of methods to assess mental health. From our perspective, using a range of methods to assess diets also leads us to believe in it more strongly, because we know that there's probably no inherent bias that's present in all of the studies. So they used a range of different methods, such as 24-hour recalls, food frequency questionnaires, and dietary records. So that led on then to this very exciting study where really people were trying to see, okay, we have all of this observational data. Pulling it all together is giving us some indication that there is a relationship between adherence to a healthy diet and reduced risk of depression. So let's try test it out in a randomized controlled trial. So this is probably the best randomized controlled trial that's been published in the area. And it looked at trying to improve the diet of adults that already had depression, and to see could they improve it by intervening with a dietary procedure. So what they done in this instance was it was a 12-week parallel randomized controlled trial of an adjunctive dietary intervention in the treatment of moderate to severe depression. They recruited into the study 67 adults, and they randomized them into one of two groups. The dietary group, which received intensive dietary counselling so that they could change their diet. So over those 12 weeks, they had 7 individual nutritional counselling sessions where they were guided on how to change their diet. The control group had also had the same amount of interaction and the same amount of individual sessions, but they were giving no information about how to change their diet. They were called the social group. And it was very important for the group to do this because they wanted the same interaction in the control group as what they had in the dietary group, but they really went to a long length of not making sure that they didn't change their diet, the control group, or that they weren't given any information that they could change their diet. The primary outcome of this study was depression symptoms assessed using the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, and their hypothesis was that the dietary group would have improved depression symptoms at the end of the 12-week intervention. So what they'd done was they modified the diet using this MODI Mediterranean diet. So it's a modified version of the Mediterranean diet. So it was a Mediterranean diet tailored to Australia, because the study was done in Australia. And what they done was they encouraged the participants to increase their consumption of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, oily fish, legumes and nuts. But in difference to the normal Mediterranean diet, they actually also allowed moderate consumption of red meat and dairy. Usually in the normal Mediterranean diet that we see in Spain and Italy, for example, they have very low consumption of red meat and dairy. But to keep it in line with the diet that's commonly consumed in Australia, they allowed moderate consumption of red meat and dairy. And as I said in the previous slide, the changes in this diet were given in individualized sessions with a trained dietitian. Now this is quite hard to see properly on the screen, but what you can see here is this is the dietary group. This is the social group, and these are the symptoms of depression measured on the scale. And the bottom line is over here, showing that they significantly improved in the dietary group, and they didn't change over the 12-week period in the social group. The other important thing to note down here is their measure of their diet. So they had a score on how they adhered to this modified Mediterranean diet. And the dietary group significantly improved, but the social group didn't change their dietary intake as assessed by this score. So what they concluded from this study then was that the MODI-Med diet, as they call it, a modified Mediterranean diet, significantly improved symptoms of depression in these adults. But what was also important about this trial is that it provided really the first randomized controlled trial evidence that dietary improvement could be a treatment strategy in these individuals. They also showed very nicely that they could work with patients with mental illness, and they could make them, allow them or help them to improve their dietary intake, and that it was quite feasible over a 12-week period. However, on the negative side, the sample size was quite low, so it was only 67 individuals. So they would need to replicate this in larger studies and to make sure that we could reproducibly do this type of work. The other study was, and they highlighted this in their paper, was their inability to blind participants to group allocation. And this is always going to be a limitation of this type of study. So participants read about the study, they knew, and you have to tell the participants what type of study it is, so they knew it was going to be a dietary study. So they got a higher dropout rate in the control group, so those that weren't getting dietary advice on their group. And of course you don't want dropouts in your study. So and then they could never really 100% guarantee that the control group weren't changing their diet as well. But overall, if you take the results from it, it's an extremely positive study, extremely well done study, and it really provides evidence that for dietary improvement as a treatment strategy. There's another study then that also provides some evidence that it's worth mentioning, and this is a study that emerged from Spain called the PREDIMED study. So this is one of the largest clinical trials done in nutrition ever, really, but their primary outcome was cardiovascular events. And they recruited, I think, nearly 8,000 people across Spain, and they put them on a Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil and a Mediterranean diet with nuts, and they looked at their outcome in terms of cardiovascular events. However, they also had an interest in depression, and they've published this paper, which is a secondary analysis of the data, looking at the adherence of the Mediterranean dietary pattern and depression. From the outset, though, we need to realise that this study wasn't set up to look at depression. It was set up to look at cardiovascular events, so it's not powered sufficiently to look at depression. But it does add to the evidence base there. So what they've done is they recruited about 9,000 individuals. They randomised them either to a control group, a group that would follow a Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts, or a group that would follow a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil. And they followed these individuals for 3 years. And for this paper, what they were interested in doing was to see, was there any difference in between these groups in the number of individuals that went on to develop depression. And what they found was in the Mediterranean diet supplemented with nuts, there seemed to be a reduced number of individuals that went on to develop depression. However, it was not statistically significant in this group. However, when they zoomed in on only those individuals that had diabetes, it was statistically significant. So again, I will say that the study wasn't powered for this outcome, but it does provide us evidence, and it supports the observational evidence that we've seen that their increased adherence to a Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of depression. So the conclusion then overall from both of these interventions show that nutrition or dietary interventions show great promise in the prevention and treatment of depression. However, much more studies are needed to replicate these findings. We're really only at the cusp or the start of this, and we need much more randomized controlled trials to try replicate it in a diverse group, more diverse groups of individuals and in larger populations. There are other emerging evidence, so that's where really the key evidence is in what I've presented you up to now. So the observational data, the data from those 2 randomized controlled trials. But there's other emerging evidence that a lot of people are starting to talk about now, and that's revolving around our gut, our bacteria that live in our gut, or our gut microbiota. So there's a lot of interest in the bacteria and how certain types of bacteria have importance for our health. And what you'll hear people talking about is the gut-brain axis. So the bacteria producing metabolites and producing substances that then are important for signaling in our brain. We know that diet impacts hugely on the type of bacteria that are present in our gut. So therefore now there's an emerging big interest in seeing if you can modify your diet to modify your microbiota, and that potentially then has a modification on your gut-brain axis. There is emerging evidence that probiotics, or taking probiotics, may be a useful dietary strategy for mental health. But I would say that this is really at the early stages, and we really don't have enough evidence in this field yet. It's looking promising, but really more work is needed to confirm these initial findings before we can make any recommendations in terms of probiotics and mental health. So if we look at all of this together then, what we're concluding is that we need more randomized controlled trials to demonstrate efficacy. But what's also important is we need now to start looking at what are the mechanistic pathways. How is diet and nutrition having an impact on mental health? And we really need to understand that so that we can start to make proper recommendations. We need also to realise that it's probably not one dietary factor or one food that we're eating. It's probably a combination of foods and nutrients, and they're working in a synergistic fashion to have an impact on our health and on our mental health. So then, if we summarise the evidence then, dietary improvements or strategies could be considered to support traditional treatment methods, but definitely not to replace. And that study that I showed you with the RCT from Australia used it in conjunction with traditional treatment methods. Evidence is really starting to emerge in the last 5 years or so about the importance of a healthy diet, and in particular about the importance of a healthy diet that reflects high consumption of fruit and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and oily fish. The field is really emerging, and it's likely only to make a significant impact in the coming years, and I think we will see this field flourishing in the next 5 to 10 years. There are people who are already starting to make recommendations based on some of the data that has come out that I have presented to you. And I've looked at some of this, and this is probably one of the best papers. And what they've started to do is really say, okay, we're starting to see all this evidence now. Let's try to start see if we could push the boundaries a little bit and start to make dietary recommendations for the prevention of depression. Some of these authors were the authors that carried out the randomized controlled trial in Australia. So I'm going to point out the 5 key recommendations that have emerged from this paper. So I've summarised them here, and the first one is to follow traditional dietary patterns such as the Mediterranean diet, the new Nordic diet or a Japanese diet. Now all of these diets are, when you look down at them, they're quite similar. So the new Nordic diet is essentially something similar to the Mediterranean diet, but it's using local sourced foods from Nordic countries. So they use a lot of berries, they use rye, a high amount of whole grain from rye, and they also use foraging to try forage and something that they would have traditionally done in their diet. They recommend that in point 2 to increase your consumption of fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts and seeds. And what they say here is that your main energy from your diet should come from these food sources. And again, that's based on the observational data, and it's also based on the randomized controlled trial, where they did increase the fruit, vegetables and legumes and nut consumption of the participants. The third point they make is that include consumption of foods rich in omega-3 and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And these are oily fish, for example. So they recommend at least 2, if not more, portions of oily fish a day as a preventative method. The fourth point is limit your intake of processed foods, fast foods, commercial bakery goods and sweets. And it's really replacing those foods with the foods that are present in number 2, so these fruits and vegetables and legumes. And again, that's more or less what they're saying in point 5, replace unhealthy foods with wholesome, nutritious foods. So these are the 5 recommendations that have come out of the evidence that we have, or the scientific evidence that we have, and that the scientists are happy to say that we have enough evidence to recommend this in terms of depression. But of course, it's a long way before these will make their way into proper recommendations. This is just a first step from a scientific publication point of view. So for the last couple of slides, I'm going to talk about something slightly different, but really quite relevant to implementing nutrition and implementing nutrition in mental health. And this is this concept of personalised nutrition. And this concept has emerged in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's tailoring the advice to the individual. So it's moving away from a generic advice to everybody, that everybody should have 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, everybody should eat so many portions of dairy. It's looking at the individual and it's saying, okay, based on your individual profile, your phenotype, your genetics, this is the personalised dietary recommendations we give for you. It's using metabolic data, so phenotype data for the individual, and tailoring the diet to that individual. It has huge potential in the area of disease prevention and treatment, but it also has huge potential in increasing the adherence to dietary improvements or dietary strategies. So it really helps the people to realise that the recommendations or the advice they're giving them are tailored to their individual needs, but also maybe to their likes and their dislikes. So we've been working on this concept of personalised nutrition and seeing how we could potentially use it. And eventually we want to be is down here, where you take a blood sample from an individual and you have a profile of that individual, and then you give them their own personalised dietary advice that is suited to their individual needs. Now, we're not quite there yet because we have an awful lot of evidence base to build up so we can get there. But we have done some randomized controlled trials in the area, and I'm going to show you one because I think it has a nice potential application. So this was a randomized controlled trial that we've done in 7 countries across Europe. And we were one centre in Dublin. It was coordinated by John Matters in Newcastle University. And what we were trying to do was implement a strategy for personalised nutrition that could be delivered over the internet. So we didn't have to meet the individuals, and we could keep contact with them either over the internet or by the phone. And we asked the question, if we give people personalised nutrition advice, would they improve their dietary intake more than what if we gave them generic healthy eating guidelines? So to do this, we recruited 1,280 individuals across Europe. We randomised them into either generic healthy eating guidelines or personalised nutrition guidelines. And personalised nutrition included different levels of personalisation. So we assessed their dietary intake, we took a blood sample from them, we assessed their metabolic profile, we done some genetic analysis on their DNA. We took a lot of information from these individuals at baseline, their dietary data, their physical activity data. We took a blood sample and a DNA sample. And we repeated this at month 1, month 2, month 3 and month 6. And this was our end point here at month 6. And our hypothesis was that this group, this personalised group, would improve their dietary intake more than this group here, which were the generic dietary advice group. So the primary outcome was dietary intake at 6 months. So did the personalised nutrition work better for those individuals that received it? And you can see it did, and I can show the results are shown here. So in orange is month 3 and green is month 6. This is our healthy eating index. So it's a measure of the overall dietary quality of the diet, and it's significantly improved compared to the control group at month 3 and month 6. The individuals reduced their salt intake, and they also reduced their saturated fat intake. So what we found was that the participants ate significantly healthier diets after receiving personalised nutrition advice compared to the control group. Now, I'll remind you that we never met these participants. We done everything over the internet. So it's an extremely scalable method of delivering dietary advice to the individuals. And you can maintain a lot of contact with them, either through messages, through emails, or through phone contact. So it's a real potential for use for people that can't visit centres, find it difficult to make it on time, where resources of dietitians are low. We can really scale this type of to a wider range of individuals. Now finally then, I just wanted to spend the last few minutes talking about some work that we also do with Professor David Cotter in Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And as I said at the outset, a lot of our work is trying to understand the molecules that are present in our body and how they impact on our health. So we've been working for the last 4 to 5 years with David, trying to see if we can see signatures present in blood in young children that can predict their mental health issues in later life. So to do this, we've been using a study called the Spock Study. So this is a study that was performed in the UK, and it followed individuals, it followed women from when they were pregnant, then it followed the children that were born from those mothers right up until they're 25. So we had samples from the kids when they were 11, and we had samples from the kids when they were 18. And what we asked was, could we see a signature when they were age 11 that's disruptive or indicating of a disruption in metabolism that was related to whether they went on to develop psychotic disorder at age 18 or not. And what we found is we found a lipid profile that was different at age 11, that was different between the cases and the controls. Now at age 11, all of the participants were healthy and they had no psychotic episodes or disorders. So it was quite remarkable that we could find a particular signature that was predictive or was indicative of mental health issues in later life. So we're following this up now, and we're really trying to understand this signature, trying to see, is diet playing a role? What other factors are playing a role? And if we could use this signature in conjunction with other parameters to develop a risk model where you could identify individuals at risk and intervene much earlier with them. So it's a very exciting project that we're working on, and now we're getting the next set of samples from Alspac to continue the work with David. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and as any time I give a talk, I have to thank the team in UCD. So this is my research team in UCD. I have to thank everybody who funds our work, and I'll thank you for listening, and I'd be delighted to take any questions.